Despite losing the presidential election and their majority in the Senate, Republicans did very little self-reflection at CPAC this past weekend, instead focusing their attention on denying election results and, of course, owning the libs. According to Jonathan Martin of the New York Times, quote, "It's why so many traditional Republicans are appalled or at least alarmed that Trumpism is replacing conservatism."
Joining us now to discuss, host of the New York Times, The Argument, Jane Coaston. Welcome back to the show, Jane. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Jane.
Thanks so much for having me. Good
Absolutely.
to see you.
What did you make of CPAC? I thought your colleague, now a new colleague, Jonathan Martin, actually did a pretty good job. I mean, I wouldn't give as much service to the traditional conservatives who want it to be replaced, but it is actually stunning. And I said this on the show today, which is at CPAC, they didn't even try. They didn't go after the minimum wage. They didn't talk about this COVID relief bill. They barely talked about Biden. Almost none of it had anything to do with what I think a lot of people would consider policy, which people care about, or am I wrong?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I think this is an important thing to understand about CPAC, CPAC is a very specific event.
Yes.
This is like if you go to like the Libertarian Party conference and there's the guy arguing that children should have heroin, like this is a very specific event for a very specific audience. This is an audience that wants fan service, and they got that this weekend at CPAC. CPAC was not focused on policy because Trumpism, or the conceit of Trumpism, was never really focused on policy. What they wanted to hear was that Ted Cruz is going to shout about freedom. And the one person, I thought it was interesting that my colleague brought up that the one person who even referenced the debt was South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who very briefly said something about like an increase in national debt, and no one applauded.
Yeah.
No one had anything to say about that, which makes sense coming off 4 years of Trump, who notably didn't really care about the deficit. But I would say that to me, it's interesting because CPAC has always been a fascinating reflection of a section of conservatism. Let's keep in mind that before Trump, past winners of the CPAC straw poll have been Mitt Romney, Jack Kemp, Ron Paul, like not people who then went on to obviously become presidents of the United States. This is a very specific audience, but it is reflective of what this audience wants to hear about, which is not conservatism. It's Trump. That's what they want, and that's what they got.
Right.
What did you make, Jane, of the straw poll results? We covered them here. They did one version with Trump and then one version without Trump. And, he still won a majority of voters. But given that, like you said, this is basically like a Donald Trump rally, I was actually surprised he didn't perform better.
I think that there is still a sense of what Trump means to this movement and what Trump means to this movement going forward. Because, and I have my own personal conflicts about this. I've actually got a piece coming out in the Times in a couple of days on this very idea, which is that does Trumpism work without Trump? I say no. I say that we've seen that time and time again, that if you are not Trump, you cannot be Trump. It's sort of like you really like the Beatles, so here are Wings. Like it's not going to work. But I do think that there are some people who are saying that Trump got us started, but he's not the right messenger. What if we could have this person who's Trumpy but not rude, or Trumpy but not Donald Trump? And so that, you see popular politicians among conservatives like Governor Ron DeSantis or even Senator Josh Hawley, this idea of like you could inherit the mantle of Trumpism without the baggage of being Donald Trump. But I'm very dubious about that, about what that means, especially because the person who can decide if you are Trumpy enough is Donald Trump. Like if Donald Trump came out tomorrow and said that Senator Josh Hawley has betrayed us all, well, I think that that's kind of it for his hopes of inheriting this mantle.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So what do you think, what do you make then of like the DeSantis hype in particular? I watched DeSantis with a lot of interest. It does seem to have legitimate excitement amongst some of the grassroots around the way he handled COVID, around obviously the media hates him, which makes him somebody who is generally beloved amongst the Republican base. But I mean, what do you think? There's a lot of efforts I've seen amongst some of the MAGA people to be like, DeSantis is it, like this is happening. What do you make of his electoral prospects then?
I think that it's interesting because I think that second point you brought up is so important because DeSantis does not exist in a vacuum. DeSantis exists as the antithesis of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo or other blue state governors, where you can put up Ron DeSantis in opposition to them. In a vacuum, I'm not sure, because I just keep thinking about how DeSantis is viewed as like, this stalwart for freedom when he's attempting to pass new legislation that would essentially introduce a new Section 230 just in the state of Florida, which makes no sense whatsoever. And also new laws on protesting, which he then later decided was like, oh, it's also about January 6th. It wasn't. But I think that so many of these people exist in opposition to a conceit. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we see. I was interested in how this year's CPAC was America Uncanceled, and yet, as CPAC tradition goes, they had to cancel a speaker for being, in this case, blindingly anti-Semitic. Yeah. But it really gets to the idea of, like, why did you pick the speaker in the first place? And someone mentioned, like, I think it was on Hot Air, Ala Pundit was writing, like, did this person also hate the libs? Because I think that, again, when you're thinking of this movement as an oppositional movement, Ron DeSantis is an oppositional candidate. He is a candidate who exists in opposition to blue state governors or this conceit of what blue states are doing. So I don't know if he works in a vacuum. I don't know if he works with here is what Ron DeSantis would do. It's more of well, he wouldn't do these things.
Right.
Yeah, I went and perused some of Young Pharaoh's timeline to figure out what was going on with him after he was canceled. It was really something. Yeah. Not only the, what did you say, blinding anti-Semitism, but also he believes weather machines were behind the storms in Texas. So there's that too.
Yep.
Another figure that I find interesting on the right is Kristi Noem. She's the governor of South Dakota. She's got kind of like a Sarah Palin vibe going. And same thing, her actual record in terms of dealing with COVID in her state was appallingly bad. They had, a high number of deaths and all of that. But she has seized on these sort of like culture war issues to get a good response in audiences like CPAC. What do you make of her?
I think it very much is that same. She exists as an oppositional candidate, especially because when liberals or anyone points out the poor performance of South Dakota's COVID response, she can just say, like, oh, the media is coming against me. So much of this is about being oppositional or being, and I mean this in attempting to the most neutral way possible, reactionary, in reaction to something else. Kristi Noem exists as a reactionary person. Ron DeSantis exists as a reactionary person. And like we see that all the time on the left as well, that there are people who exist in reaction to something else. So much of the super pro Andrew Cuomo sentiment that we saw in 2020 was he was a reaction to Trump and like, oh, at least he's not Trump. Well, it turns out that not being Donald Trump is not like the highest bar you can possibly clear. But I think that Noem, again, is someone who exists in this bandwidth. And I think that it's a fascinating bandwidth to inherit because those culture war cudgels, there's no legislation that needs to be passed to have that. You just have to tweet the right things and show up at these conferences and maybe call for a congressional hearing or suggest an executive order saying that universities can't do something. And we see this time and time and time again because actual problems and actual challenges, I think that there is an interesting conversation that could be starting to be had among conservatives about the minimum wage. You're starting to get some support, even from organizations like Heritage, for raising the minimum wage. We see these occasional moments of actual policy, but policy is really hard. And the major stakeholders in conservative politics maybe don't have that much of an interest in, say, increasing the minimum wage or making health insurance more available or doing a lot of the child care credit. So those things are hard, but it's really easy to own the libs and talk about cancel culture.
Yeah,
it's the easiest thing in the world.
Carry a gun somewhere you're not supposed to have a gun or whatever.
Right. Exactly.
Well, always appreciate hearing from you, Jane. Thanks very much. And everybody go subscribe to the podcast. The Argument is fantastic.
Yep. Great to have you, Jane. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good seeing you.
Coming up is the Biden administration advocating for near a tandem more than they are going to bat for the minimum wage. Ryan Grimm's going to talk about that when Rising returns.